Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Coding Challenge series. Last week I showed you how to solve the first part of the challenge using integer numbers, so make sure to check that video out first if you've missed it. I'll leave a link to it in the top right hand corner of your screen. However, if you remember, when I set this challenge 2 weeks ago, I also gave you a bonus question. What if the input of our function were a floating point number instead of an integer? Today, I will give you my solution to this question, and for all of you who have attempted it, please remember that your solution may be different to mine. Now though, let's get started. What happens when we try and format a floating point number? Well, as I'm sure you can see, our current function is not sufficient to format floating point numbers. However, when we think of a floating point number, these are made up from two separate parts, an integer part, a decimal part, and these are divided by a period. So if we can split our number into its integer part and decimal part, then all we have to do is format the integer part and then reunite or rejoin the new formatted integer part and the decimal part together, and that will give us a correctly formatted floating point number. So let's try and translate what I've just said into a function. We will give a little bit of space and say define. Let's call this one format number float, and we will give it our number to format. And the first thing we have to do is split our floating point number into an integer part and a decimal part. Now we can do this quite easily by saying num split and putting that as equal to our number made into a string again, and then saying dot split, and then where do we want to split our number? Well, we want to split it where we have our period, and in that way we will have two separate parts. We will have our integer part and we will have our decimal part. Now that we have our number split into two parts, let's isolate the integer section by saying integer equals num split 0. In other words, the first part of our split number. Now we want to format the integer part of our number, which we can do by saying result equals, and then all we do is call the function which we wrote earlier to format our integer numbers. So we can say format number of integer. However, remember that on line 13, our integer number is currently a string, whereas our format number function wants the number as an integer. So how can we change that? Well, simply on line 13, we can convert our string into an integer by saying int of num split 0. Now, if this is unfamiliar to you, make sure to check my tutorial by clicking on the link in the top right-hand corner of your screen, where I go into full detail on how to convert one type of variable into another. Now that we have our result, in other words, our formatted integer number, all we have to do, as we said before, is reunite the integer part and its decimal part with a period in the middle. So we can do that by saying result equals result. So we are adding to our result variable. And what do we need to add? Well, we need to add a period. And then, of course, we need to add our decimal part. Now, where do we find our decimal part? Well, it comes from num split, and it is the second part of what we split earlier. So we can say num split 1. So again, to reiterate, num split 0 is the integer part of our number, and num split 1 is the decimal part of our number. We can of course conclude by writing return result. Now we can check this function to make sure it works by clicking the F5 key and saying on the right hand side, format number float, and saying that this is equal to 1,000,000. If I can get the number of zeros correct, that should be right. 0.1234. So this is a floating point number. And that, of course, will give us the correctly formatted number. So as you can see, there are commas separating the integer part of the number, followed by the decimal portion. Now, as you can see, this function works correctly for floating point numbers. But why should we have to use two different functions depending on the type of number we have? Why can't we just use our second function for all numbers? Well, to do that, we would have to modify it slightly. And that is, in line 12, where we split our number, if the number is an integer, so it doesn't have a decimal part, when it is split, it will only have a single portion. So line 13 will work correctly, as will line 14. However, line 15 will not work because num split 1, which is our decimal portion of the number, if we are dealing with an integer, will not exist. So this will create an error. So how can we avoid incurring in an error? Simply by putting line 15 inside of an if statement. And what will this if statement be? Well, simply, if our num split on line 12 has a length of 2, that means that it has an integer part and a decimal part. Whereas if its length is 1, it means that it will only have an integer part. So, given that on line 16 now, we are adding the decimal part back onto our integer number, we can only do that if our num split has a length of 2, meaning that we have an integer and a decimal part. So we can say if len of num split is equal to 2, then our result can have its decimal part added to it. Otherwise, the result will only be the integer part. Now, if we run this function and look on the right-hand side again, we can call the same function from before, and of course it will work. But if we now say format number float and call an integer number, so without a decimal portion, this will also work correctly because of what we have added. So as you can see, we have successfully completed this episode. I hope you enjoyed this fun coding challenge, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. In the meantime, make sure to check out my tutorial videos, which you can access by clicking on the banner in the top right-hand corner of your screen or through the link in the video description. If you missed the previous coding challenge, check it out by clicking on the box in the top right-hand corner of your screen now or on the link in the video description. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos. As always, see you next time and happy coding!